Hey everybody, and welcome to another chat with Taekwondo Coach Academy. That's Adrian Byrne and Richie Ford, and we're bringing to you a little bit of content highlighting the very best of ITF Taekwondo, both coaching, practice and competition. Today we're going to have a Q&A based on some of the questions that have been asked on our Instagram feed over the last couple of weeks, and we're just going to dig into the questions, have a quick chat and share our thoughts on what's being asked. Some of them, they'll be a little hard to say definitively what's being asked, but we are going to try and interpret that as best we can. And we'll really just jump straight into it and answer as many of the questions as we possibly can today. So, Richie, do you want to lead off on the first one? Because this was one that just, we get asked this absolutely the whole time. And I think it's just one that everybody who's starting off in coaching really needs to get into.
Yeah, so this is a very important one, and it's something that coaches who are quite experienced will almost take this for granted a little bit. So the question is, any tips on how to get bigger respect from kids in Taekwondo lessons?
Yeah.
And the comment is, I guess I'm too friendly, they just abuse that. So yeah, I think there's definitely a fine balance to get there between being super friendly and also having that structure and discipline. Like if you think about it, a lot of parents will send their children to Taekwondo to get that discipline. So it's almost expected to be in a martial art. But of course, in this day and age, it's very important to be engaging with the children and also have that like friendly atmosphere in the classes. So it's very, very important to be able to balance the two. I think in practical terms, it's very important to have a consistent structure in your classes. And I
Definitely.
think that children naturally crave this. Like I know from being in the school teacher and working in the classroom with children, they crave this a lot to have the consistent structure and they want things to be the same as best as possible. And that it kind of allows them to understand the boundaries a little bit more. So I think that's very, very important if you have that consistent structure in terms of how your class is set up, what you do when this happens, what you do when that happens. I think that's a great place to start. So like as well as that, you can also use some simple examples like using praise. So you can
Mm-hmm.
say, for example, oh, I see that Adrian there is standing really attentively and he's listening to me. And then all of a sudden, all the other children will adapt to that and try to copy that behavior. So you can kind of manipulate that a little bit as well to come up with things that you want to see in your class to help with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a tendency as well to look at some of the things that we do traditionally in martial arts. So referring to the instructor as sir, miss, the bowing in at the start, lining up, all of those kind of things that they're not always needed, or they're not needed in every class, but they do, as you say, provide that structure. They provide that element or that baseline that you can work from. And kids would be more comfortable. It's almost like a pack animal mentality. Like, when you know what the order of things is, the structure of things is, it's going to be an awful lot easier to fit in and find your boundaries within that environment. And I think that becomes doubly important when you have somebody who is within the class with additional learning needs, or who is perhaps struggling on the social level, so, autistic spectrum disorder or something like that, where there's just that little bit of extra need for structure to give a safe, comfortable footing, and everything can go from there. And it doesn't make you distant. And I think that's sometimes the worry, is that, having a structure and formally organizing the class, it doesn't make you distant as a coach, and it doesn't make the sessions unfun. There are anchor points in the session where everybody knows how it goes. And I think for me, the big point on this one is it's the first kind of, if you have a brand new group and nobody has trained before, this is the most difficult because they have no culture to fit into. So it must be what it's like for a primary school teacher taking in all of the kids, if they've never done preschool or something like that. I'd say they can really tell the difference because, I know the difference going into class if someone has had a year or two of school behind them. They just get that sometimes we line up, sometimes we sit in our spot, sometimes we do X, Y, or Z. And the ones who haven't had much school, they're the ones that, they don't get the sharing, they don't get the structure of it so quickly. And so for the first few weeks, we're really keen to reinforce the same warm-ups, the same initial few exercises, the same things that we break the same way. And then we gradually introduce the variety over time when we know we can get back the attention of the class.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important there as well, based on that. And when you think about the activities that you're using, just like you said, keeping the consistency there, I think it's important as well to understand what kind of a structure you have within those as well. So, like for example, if you're have a very young age, who maybe are just starting that school age, and they're standing around a lot of the time waiting during lines, things like that. Obviously, that's not really the case now at the moment with COVID, but generally you'll see people that have the long lines and things like that. People are waiting around to have their chance in the activity,
Hmm.
etc. I think that that's actually something that you can just nip in the bud early and try to focus your sessions around keeping everybody busy and active as often as possible. And the more the children are engaged, the more fun they're having, the less you're going to have to like enforce that structure really, because it's going to almost take care of itself. So I think that's a great place to start, especially with the younger kids. Always focusing your sessions on keeping everybody engaged, keeping everybody busy at all times. And maybe like you have to remember that this isn't going to be like a simple version of the adults class. You're going to have to literally turn it upside down and do things completely different, because it's just like the cognitive ability and things like that are completely different in children. So that's very, very important. And besides that, I would also give the advice of catch them doing well. So if you see behavior that you do like, make it your point to catch them doing well, acknowledge that and praise that among the class, and
Yeah.
within a short time you'll notice that everybody is just adapting that way and trying to behave in a similar fashion.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the bit that kind of leads to all of that is you have to actually plan for those exciting practices. So you won't do it just off the cuff. So you need to
Yeah.
plan, where's the structure going to be? What is the routine going to be when we do X, Y, Z? How do we go from being in lines and doing pattern work or something to being with a partner and holding a kick shield? That
Mm.
doesn't happen intuitively or automatically. How that happens, how it's progressed, so it doesn't take 2 or 3 minutes and an instructor shouting, but it's something that happens in 20 or 30 seconds and everybody waiting, ready to go. I mean, it takes some planning, it takes some practice.
Yeah, I think like even something simple there, like having everybody either standing up, having everybody sitting down. That's something that I know I spoke to one of my coaches about last week. She's doing a phenomenal job just starting off in her coaching, learning the ropes, as we say.
Yeah.
But one little small tip I had for her at the end is some people were standing, some people were sitting, as she was given the coaching cues and explaining the exercises. And that just creates that little bit of contrast in terms of some people are chatting, some people are not. Whereas if you have everything just uniform, I think it helps massively. And I'd like to, as I'm speaking, maybe sit down, legs crossed, and listening. And then everybody's in the same boat. Everybody knows what to expect. And I think that that's an important thing for children. They know what to expect.
Yeah.
And I think just like coming back to the question itself as well, of having that balance between respect and being friendly, I think it's very important to build that relationship with the children. So know what they're about, talk to them about their day at school, all these simple things as they come in the door. But then they know that there's a certain line that you don't cross.
Mm.
So I think that's very, very important to build a relationship. Let them know that you're approachable, let them know that you're friendly, but there is that line that you're the coach, instructor, and they're the students, and they need to respect and obey by the rules of the classes, basically.
Yeah, I think that the last point that I have on this really is that it's something, a big concept like respect is an awful lot simpler when it comes to kids, and it's almost like there's a trust element to it. And all trust
Yeah.
is for kids is that when you say something, or it goes by your behavior as well, but when you say something, you're going to do it. There's no flip flopping between, well, you threatened them and then you didn't do it, or everything
Great
has to
point.
be exactly as you say it, very clear, no ambiguity, no loss of temper, just very, very consistent. Hey, we said this was the rule. That's it. So we're going to do it. And one that I always kind of think, it always comes in with the thing of respect, but there's the crime and punishment thing, which, we don't like to think in terms of punishing children. But what we are thinking about is enforcing rules and having consequences for people doing things that aren't within the rules. And you have to have consequences that you can live with and that aren't heavy-handed. So, figuring out what you're going to do I think is something that you really want to have sorted before you come to the class. Otherwise, you end up doing things like, making threats of, if you don't sit down now, we're going to do this, or if you don't listen, we'll do whatever. And they don't make sense, and the kids will jump on that really, really quickly. So if you have a very simple, structured, whether it's something like a timeout or you're removing someone from an activity, or that there's a playtime or golden time is reduced, or whatever it happens to be, that everyone understands it. It's very, very clear. It's very, very simple, and that leads to trust.
Yeah, Absolutely. I think, and just on a final point on that as well, I think that if you can actually give the children a little bit of ownership of that,
Mm,
where they come up with the rules of what's acceptable behavior, what's not acceptable behavior, and the consequences, I think that
yeah,
that makes them even more accountable then again.
100%. So let's have a look at the next little question. So changing tone and looking a little bit at sparring, how can you train to not be rigid in combat? And again, a lot of the questions we do get are like, it's very impressive. People are talking to us in their second or third language, and you'll see it with some of the questions that have come up. But in this case, we're just going to assume they mean sparring rather than fighting in self-defense. Um, so how can you train not to be rigid?
Yeah, well, I think if you look at it, just look at it from a broad perspective. When you look at certain martial arts, there's that natural, like rigidness with them. So you look at things like Muay Thai and sports like that. You have that natural rigid posture and things like that. So I think a great way to start is just to try to be a little bit more playful. I think it's almost impossible to be rigid and playful at the same time. So if you can
Mm-hmm.
just bring that little bit more play aspect into your sparring, I think that first off is going to be a massive start.
Yeah, I don't think the rigidity typically is physical. I think usually speaking, it's psychological. It's that you're overthinking. And when your brain is so occupied and has so many things that it's processing, you end up in a position where you kind of lock up, or you feel like you've locked up, or things aren't moving the way that you would associate with flow. And I think freeing up your mind is one of the first things that you can do. And a lot of the time, when we look at our training principles, what we'll look to do in sparring is simplify the game state. So how do we make it so that we can make a simple decision? And once you only have a simple decision to make, and you're not trying to think your way through the whole match, or the full analysis of the opponent, or the fight or flight thing is kicking in. If you have a very simple decision, do I stay or do I go? Do I left or right? Do I attack or defend? If you can make it really simple in every situation, then you can relax a little bit and do what you do in training.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good idea. It's something that I used to actually use to kind of just build up that little element of footwork movement and things like that. Is I used to go into rounds and plan on actually not landing any techniques. So I'd go in and spar with somebody, and my simple aim was just not to get hit. And I would just move around, avoid, stay within the confines of a certain area. And that just naturally brings out that kind of playful and more kind of fluid
Mm.
approach to your sparring. And I think it really, really helps. It just get that footwork going, to get that body movement, and just to free up your body a little bit to move, and just kind of enjoy it a little bit more as well.
Yeah, I think just from would say, and it links to our next question a little bit as well. When you're training on the pads, or you're doing more solo training, you don't have an opponent. One of the things that becomes somewhat valuable is rhythm drills. So where your recovery is challenged, your movement is challenged in some way. But the main thing is that the movements are continuous, one into the next, into the next. And what you can get with a little bit of rhythm, or even the explosive repeats on the more kind of high power end of it, is you don't have time to lock up. You have to find a way to not get rigid at the end of the movements, to not start from fixed positions. You have to start from more dynamic positions over time. And when I think when you get that rhythm going, like you said, it's like loosening out that footwork. There is a relaxation to it and a flow to it, and I think that's a good place to start. Of course, it's not realistic, and it doesn't work when your brain is flooded with all of the sensory input of an opponent trying to hit you. But it's a good way to start, so that there is some base of flow that you can come back to if you can simplify the what's going on in the mind in the ring.
Yeah, definitely. Like if we just bring that back to, like, think of some fighters in our ITF in particular that are quite opposite of being rigid. They're fluid, they're playful. You think the likes of Julio Carlos, Alamine, people like this. They're just naturally, they have that footwork, the rhythm, and they have that playful vibe to their sparring. And I think that just all comes hand in hand in the opposite of rigidity.
Sure. So the question I was mentioning is any tips around contactless sparring training during COVID? And like we have kind of tackled this a little before, or mentioned it before, that sparring training is very, very limited when you don't have an opponent, because you're not presenting the action, the reaction, the stimulus and the response in in a natural setting. It doesn't provoke the same responses. So it basically, what you're doing won't transfer over quite as well into free sparring as you'd like it to do. But if you're stuck, you're stuck. And, if it's a case of, well, what can you do? Often the first part of it is set yourself a goal, set yourself a challenge around perhaps you want to expand your range of techniques. Yeah, absolutely. You can do a little bit of work on that. Just developing the flow of them, finding challenging combinations, or not even challenging to like complicated, but that challenge the entry and exit from the technique, or that challenge the position as you go into it. And you really do have to focus on the mental training a certain amount, and your kind of imagery and your imagination, because without an actual opponent, it's really, really difficult, you know. But you can move, you can hit a bag, and it's not the worst thing to be doing. Certainly you will get some sparring specific fitness, but it's not going to train your brain the way you want to train your brain.
Yeah, and just that's hitting the nail on the head, as you said. It's this whole idea of perception action coupling. And if we just bring that back into simple terms, it's everything that we do in sparring is related to a certain thing that we see or perceive or take in from the environment. So that might be your body position, and that could be consciously or subconsciously, basically on how you hold your hands, how you hold your positioning of your shoulders, hips, etc. And these are all cues that we take in sparring that result in us like executing a particular action, whether that's avoiding, moving, a technique, whatever. And without a partner, that's very, very difficult. And so I think that, like, to get the real high level skill of what sparring needs to be, you need that, and you need that interaction with another training partner. And of course, it depends on the level that we're looking at as well.
Yeah.
So if we look at that kind of like level of as you're developing, of course, you can work on certain techniques that you don't have rounded into your game yet, and just building up that movement pattern that you can eventually bring into your game that you would like to have. Of course, it's a good place to be. But as you said, I think it lays down onto the physical side. So your flexibility, your strength work, your fitness training, all those things, and link that together with the mental side of the game. So maybe preparing how you're going to react in certain situations, whether that's how are you going to deal with a little bit of anxiety on competition day, on grading day, things like that. And then if you can link that together with just like expanding your knowledge about the whole game. So we have, of course, Fight Chat Friday every Friday. Check that out. Expand your knowledge of how things work, why they work. I think that's a great place to be if you're unable to actually get that one-to-one partner work with somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next question actually deals with some elements of that as well. So when training for sparring, should I focus on one aspect at a time or multiple? And of course, there's different ways that we can read the question. But for me, what jumped out at my mind when I read that question was, am I training, for example, I'm doing my back kick, so, you know, or my controlling distance with the back kick, moving backwards, retreating or defensive. And it's like, okay, when you're training for sparring, do you focus on just that element, that skill, or do you focus on multiple at a time? And for me, the answer is always multiple, because even if you're only working on the back kick, you still are working on your footwork, your movement, your distance, your positioning, your rhythm, the tempo. All of those things matter the whole time when you're working on it. So you couldn't, or I would say shouldn't, work on your back kick in isolation, as in we have a fixed distance and a fixed target and a fixed, that's really rudimentary stuff. That's, I have never done a back kick before, I need to figure out where to put my feet. That's the beginning. But when you have some semblance of a back kick, when you have the basis of a technique, you need to be interpreting it as a skill as quickly as you possibly can, I think. And that's where you'd like to be doing, putting in some work on it. And it brings into the second part of it, which is, well, if you have an opponent, your opponent should be trying to achieve something in the training of this back kick as well. So if all they're trying to do is be a pad, well, just be a pad, you know, hold a pad. If you have an opponent, use the opponent, and maybe they can be trying to score with something. If you want it easy, maybe they want to score with a back leg turning kick. If you want to be a little harder, maybe they want to score with a blitz. And then both people have a viable game that they both want to win. And that should improve all of the perception and action coupling that we're looking for. It should make it more realistic to the event.
Yeah, that's something that I really, really like, the whole idea of both sides being accountable to have an objective, and you're trying to complete something and your partner's trying to complete something. I think that especially at the high level, that's so important. But when you think about like developing something into your game, I think it's very important that I think everybody generally wants to improve. That's just the natural thing that we want to do as martial artists. But I think that sometimes people worry about improving on too much. They want to come like, I need to fix this, and this. Where I think it would be much more effective if people actually double down on strengths that they have.
Mm.
So even improve them a little bit further, and that's still improving.
Yeah.
Whereas people always try to look at the maybe like the links in the chain that could get a little bit more stronger because they're holding them back. But maybe that's just not going to be part of your game. Of course, I would work on something in particular and always trying to improve. But I think there's something to be said as well for doubling down on something that you're actually quite good at. So like if I use an example from jiu-jitsu training, like in particular, I found myself getting to this particular position. It's called side control.
Hmm.
So I found I was always getting to this position, and then I decided, right, every time I'm going to go free roll in here, I'm actually going to see what I can do and discover from this position. So I think that's kind of what you were talking about there of like taking it away from the idea of the back kick just on the pad, but trying to come up with situations in more live situations where you get to kind of explore that particular area. And
Mm.
then that's where I would be focusing on just that one area. So like side control in jiu-jitsu is a massive concept. It's not just one technique. It's not just one thing.
Yeah.
Same thing with a back kick. It's one technique, but it can come in a multitude of ways, in areas, in distances, etc. So I think it's very important. Take that one thing that you want to work on. Hopefully, it's something that you've already kind of become accustomed with and you can do relatively well to bring it live. And then try create those situations with a live partner as best you can to figure it out, explore, and work from there. I think that's the most efficient way that you can improve and focus on something.
So this one you might just take off yourself as how you interpreted this. So how often should you do one-on-one with students?
Yeah, so for this one, I kind of was thinking the idea of sparring, but then I was like, is it one to one in terms of like private training as well? So I
Mm.
suppose you could look at it two ways. And the way I answered the question on Instagram at the time, I approached it in terms of one to one sparring, which is something that we've kind of touched on basically in the last two questions here. So I suppose we can maybe just skim across both concepts. For me, in terms of the one to one with students, I would like to do that almost every session. Like it's as we said, like for me, the most important thing is having that live situation with another active partner who's trying to achieve their own objective. So for me, like I would say 80 to 90% of the sparring training in my gym is done in one-to-one situations.
So I'm going to read into it a different way, just because we can.
Yeah.
So I would look at it as okay. Between sparring and patterns, two of the more prominent disciplines, I suppose, in Taekwondo. I would say that you will get massive benefit from spending quality one student to one instructor time in pattern, or even paired students each acting as a coach, over and back,
Hmm.
to where it's someone watching just you to find the way for you to improve your pattern. I think there's huge benefit in that. Group pattern training is very limited. You always end up going to the lowest common denominator when you do that, or else you keep everybody slowed while one person is trying to progress. Whereas, in the same way as you were saying earlier, identify your strengths and work from there. If you're doing pattern and have only one person watching you, you can quickly identify a strength or a critical weakness. And, often with patterns, it's looking at what's the one correction that will yield the most result. So, what can I fix in the pattern that will, in one pattern that will make all of the patterns better? That kind of an example. But then the flip side of
Yeah.
it is with the sparring, where if we take out the idea of like, okay, I'm not a huge believer unless it's absolutely necessary of one-to-one coach to athlete.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is I can hold pads fine, but I can't be a realistic opponent for most of my better competitors. I can certainly work with beginners who are my size, and they're a rare thing. But to work with my top level competitors, they should leave me for dead. Like
Yeah.
they should not be seeing reactions or couplings with me. I shouldn't be moving like the kind of opponent they're going to face. So what I want for them is more, like I want them in a group of 6 or 7 of a similar challenge level, and then they're going to see the range of lead leg attacks, the range of follow-ups that you would hope they'd see in competition, and they can better prepare from that. So for me, I strive to get one-on-one situations and patterns, and I
Yeah.
strive to get good groupings in sparring.
That's a great point. And like you just said there as well, the whole idea of if you're having a big group versus having one-to-one interaction, I think the important thing there is either or. If you, in particular in pattern anyway, if you can see one thing that is can solve a lot of problems. So for example, an L stance is pretty weak, or a sine wave needs improving. That's something that kind of will happen very, very frequently, as opposed to there might be one particular guarding block in a pattern that you want to fix technically. That's just fixing one thing. But if you can find the things that you can fix, like that will improve the pattern across the board, that happen very consistently, I think that that's a great way to go in terms of patterning particularly.
Yeah.
I also think it might be a good opportunity here, Adrian, to have a little chat about just the difference in training for sparring versus pattern, that you bring that up, the whole idea of open versus closed skill, and things like that. Would you just like explain that to some of the people watching?
Yeah, so I suppose the very first thing that when we'll link learning a pattern to learning a gymnastic sequence or something like that. Every movement has its prerequisite abilities, so you need a particular range of flexibility or leg strength, or you need balance to be of a particular level. You need your stances before you can bring your stances into movement and all the rest of it. But they're closed skills in that nothing in the environment is going to interrupt your ability to perform that skill. If you can do it in your home gym, you should be able to do it anywhere at all, under any circumstances. Nothing in the environment is going to change it, which brings out a different kind of skill set in terms of how you teach it, compared to the open skill of sparring. And every single time you spar, every opponent, and even separate spars with the same person, will go completely differently. Things can change all the time. And the defense against the side kick that you learned could be completely inappropriate in 4 out of 5 of the matches and only work one time, because it needs a little bit of tweaking or modification based on what you're seeing. So when we're training for sparring, we need to see and experience all those micro variations all the time, so that we can basically develop a feel for it. We can chunk that information and come up with a kind of a principle rather than a one-off solution. Whereas in pattern,
so variable,
in pattern we have a set answer. Now you might have to modify it to suit your abilities, but you have a set answer. There is a 100% perfect by the book, execution of a movement.
It's laid out there for people, isn't it?
Exactly. So there's not much room for individual flair in hitting a double back tuck somersault. You've pretty much got to, perform 2 rotations while going backwards and land on your feet. And the physics of how to make that happen mean it looks basically the same for everyone. And we have the same limitations when it comes to our pattern. How we go about generating the force is specified. How we go around, the dimensions of the stances, the heights and levels of the techniques, it's all specified. So because of that, we are trying to emulate a model performance. And that's about repetition. It's about, challenging that in different ways. But it really is about repetition and modeling of the ideal performance.
Exactly. And then sparring, of course, is the opposite. That, although it's traditionally how people train, as in repetition, muscle memory on techniques, there's no 2 similar techniques. And I made a post about this yesterday on our Instagram feed, that there was research study done on somebody hammering a nail 100 times. And in those 100 times, there was never 2 of the same repetition. So if that's the case in something so simple as just hammering a nail, a very simple concept, imagine when you include everything that's involved in sparring. Somebody can hit you in almost an infinite number of ways, in so much variability within that. You have different places in the ring, you've got time limits, scores, etc. Referees see different things. Even if you spar somebody, like you said, 100 times, you're never going to have the exact same fight. So just because of that, I think that there's a massive thing to be learned from this, in terms of when you train for patterns, it's a little bit different to when you train for sparring, just based on that.
Sure. So our next questions are relating to, again, another common topic for us, but what's the best way to get stronger legs? And what we might do is deal with a couple of these in one conversation. So what we're looking at is the best way to get stronger legs. What kind of method or structure do you use with your students for getting them better kicks? And how do I get a higher chamber for kicking? So if we kind of keep that family of questions together, I think that'll play to our purposes here.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a misconception basically when people say stronger legs.
Yeah,
Generally, we look at like, okay, let's go do some squats, let's do some deadlifts, etc., etc. But think about this rationally. If you ask a power lifter who's able to squat a massive squat to make a side kick and hold it in the air like Master Suska or
yeah,
somebody like Master Dulé or somebody who's an extreme kicker in ITF, like it's not going to be practical. They're not going to be able to do it at a high level. So I think the whole idea of functional strength here is super, super important. And you need to be able to link this together with what we're actually doing.
yeah,
So the whole idea of building stronger legs, I think that concept generally is misinterpreted. So like when we talk about it here specifically for kicking, you're looking at things like isometric holds, mobility, being able to hold ranges that we want to be able to hold,
mm,
and things like that. So like in simple terms, that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to extend the range that we need and try to be able to control and be strong in that range. So of course, isometric holds, things like that. PNF stretching is another option. There's plenty of things you can do, and I think that just once you have those principles and understand what you need to do, I think that like you can come up with different ways to get there and keep the sessions fresh and engaging.
hmm,
But you just need to understand those principles of what to do and how to do. And like we've got lots and lots of videos on our YouTube channel about that. So I'll actually in the top here I'll just link up a playlist that we have with lots of ideas and basically talking through all the principles that you need of getting stronger, extending the range, and being able to be strong and control that range, and coupling that all together with kicking techniques. I think that once you understand that, then the way you do it can be interpreted and a little bit more creative.
yeah. I think the two kind of interpretations you'd have in a Taekwondo specific sense for stronger legs is the ability to move with control through that range of motion as you need for both patterns and sparring, and then there's the explosive element of it. Of getting there is one thing, getting there with extreme violence is the other side of it, and yes, you do have to train better for that, but I think in general terms, the range of motion and the control needs to kind of come first, before adding that powerful, explosive, violent action. Because the downside to not doing that is if you're moving with poor mechanics and you apply load and force and power to poor mechanics, you break. And if you want people going around with their lower back tweaked and their knees in bits and the hips feeling pain and all the rest of it, then add force to a poor movement pattern, and that's what you're going to get. So one of the things that I would definitely suggest if people are working to improve their leg strength is it goes hand in hand with the flexibility training, the mobility training. You've got to be able to actively control within your range of motion where you're kicking. And if your kicks require you basically throwing your body out of position in order to reach a particular height or make something work, you've got to, from a pattern sense, kick within your range and your limits and make it effective and under control. And within a sparring sense, you have to adapt and find tactics that are going to work for you. A side kick that isn't a side kick isn't an effective threat and won't be dealt that with by your opponent. So the same tactics aren't going to work if you don't have a free front leg to throw that side kick with. And you'd probably be better off sparring in a different style with a different movement off a different facing and building into a different strategy, rather than focusing on your limitation. As we were saying earlier, focus on what you do well, focus on your strengths, make something else your strength if it needs to be in the meantime, and focus on improving the mechanics and the control first and adding the power and explosiveness later.
Yeah, I think that, that's a great idea. If you can be able to do anything really, really well and really explosively, you should also be able to do it like almost slow motion. And I think that if you can do it slow motion, that's almost like a prerequisite to be able to do it explosively. And so being able to just take that speed out and being able to do things with extreme control is actually a sign of massive strength and power, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, practicing slow won't necessarily make you fast, but it will allow the range of control and everything else. The chamber position is linked to that. That's just an extension of it, really. That you do need to actually work on emphasizing your chamber positions for your kicks, because generally speaking, poor chamber when it comes to sparring it's a bit of a giveaway that leaves someone in. It exposes you through your kicking, and in pattern we have the same phrase in pattern as we do in tech speak for programming, which is garbage in, garbage out. So if you start from a poor position, you will execute poorly, and it applies to patterns to sparring. But if you don't begin in a good place, it's different. There is one subtle difference though, which is in sparring, you can get away with being awkward. So it could be a poor position, technically, but it can still work.
Yeah,
because
you're just limited in your abilities after that. Then, if you want to kind of lead on off the side kick, maybe, then that's where it becomes a bit of a problem, maybe.
Yeah. So the question in the middle then on the method or structure that you use, really it's disguised repetition. So you want to find 1,000,001 ways to hide the fact that you're going to do another side kick today. You're going to do another 100 side kicks today or 200 side kicks today. And you don't want to feel like you're coming along to side kick class and doing 200 side kicks necessarily. Sometimes you might just do that, but realistically what you want to do is disguise the repetition, disguise the challenge, but always progressively overload. So if you can continually make it harder and more challenging, but without the students feeling like they're actually just coming back to do the same class again, then I think that's the big takeaway for me.
That's it. It's massively, like, I have like loads of exercises on all the same stuff, but the principles are the same. Like if you think about it, the students are doing the same thing. They're trying to push themselves to get beyond that range and hold that range. But there's 101 exercises you can do to challenge that. And I think just on linking that to the chamber as well, I think that it can be very effective if you can use like constraints and resources as well to do that. So like whether that's somebody holding their hand and you got to kick above it, whether that's using a beanbag to place on your leg, you don't drop it, place it on your head for posture, using a hoop that you have to kick through forces you to get above. So I think that if you can incorporate that, it makes it more engaging for the students, and it also really improves things like that chamber position, because it forces you to keep that knee up as you kick. And I think that's something that's vital for effective kicking, particularly in ITF.
Perfect. So then we have just a small little question that I kind of feel like I should take under the circumstances. My own students will understand why. So is incorporating jump rope practice good for Taekwondo? And if so, can you show us some good routines for it? So the reason I want to preempt that one is we've been working with our senior class. They've been skipping in the warm-up now for a solid 10 weeks, I'd say. Every single class, they've been doing some skipping with different challenges and variations in it.
Okay.
But it's only because of social distancing, to be quite honest. So the best social distancing tool that I found is a skipping rope. You don't want to get with that thing as people are warming up. So
I love it.
It gets people settled into the whole, right, we are actually getting a general aerobic warm-up. We're satisfying the criteria of raising the core temperature. It is vaguely specific in that, okay, the bouncing is relevant to it's a low-level plyometric exercise. It is going to work the ankles, the knees, to some degree. There is a postural and rhythmic element to it, but it's a loose and tenuous connection to specifically doing well in Taekwondo sparring. But it is one of those things of, is it like they're not excited about going into their warm-up anymore, I can tell you that much. But the reason for it was very, very simple. It's like we have all of these people in a space that we need to maintain social distance between, and we have the skipping ropes. It's a very easy exercise for us to build progressive warm-ups off of, and it takes the place of a lot of the activities we'd have traditionally done to get that initial sweat on.
Look, in terms of like an exercise, it can be fun, especially like I know when I started off skipping before, trying to learn how to do it as a skill can be quite fun and quite challenging. But in terms of, is it the best use of time you can do? For me, probably not. But as you said, like it has its places, absolutely, definitely has its places. I think the whole idea of skipping in terms of related to combat and martial arts probably comes from the traditional boxing, where it's probably used for a different reason as to what we would expect it to be. So before, like, it would have been, if you think about it, like boxing coaches would have done a lot of one-to-one coaching, so they need something to preoccupy the other people that are in the gym and in the class. So off you go do some skipping. That works your fitness. It works
On
that
the heavy
footwork. It
bag.
works staying on your toes. Work the heavy bag. All this stuff. So although, like you said, it does have its place. I think that just in terms of best use of time, probably not the best use of time.
Yeah, I would agree. So 31 years old and a red belt. I want to teach when I reach black belt. Any advice? So
Yeah, this is a good one. I think
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
no, I was going to say I don't know that this is someone from Ireland or they could be anywhere, but I think the advice is going to carry over very much the same
Sure.
either way. I mean, you're a red belt, which means you're training with somebody, and there's going to be some connection to coaching through there. So, I mean, it was interesting. Master McPhail posted a question there recently as well, both through an email and social media on, what's the story in different countries with encouraging black belts to open clubs. And, I think there's less encouragement on people or less of an emphasis on pushing people to open clubs now as the black belts tend to come through younger. And that's the first thing. And, often, particularly in Ireland, like if you go to an area like Cork, it's saturated. There are clubs everywhere. So an opportunity to find a coaching role might often be as an assistant coach within a club first, and then you might move further afield depending on where work or life generally takes you. If you find yourself in an area with no Taekwondo club, you might do that. Whereas years and years ago, it was virtually, there was a very small number of clubs. Every neighbouring town needed a club as such, and it was a bit different. But the advice is definitely the same. Start now.
Yeah.
So get a little help and support from your lead instructor. Start teaching any element of a class, because the skills that you're going to learn, the group management, the safety management, the control and organization, the practice of introducing a new skill, explaining it in a way that makes sense, that's short and succinct, that gets the message across to the audience that you're talking to. The practice of watching for what, you'll surprise yourself about with how little you know about techniques you know well. Or how hard it is to explain something first time off the bat and get the concept across in 2 clear points or 3 clear points. All of that takes practice, and if you start with that, then formal education on top of that is a great way to go. And I mean, in Ireland, it's very simple for us. There is a formal process involved. You'll do your introduction to coaching, your level 1, your level 2. You have your technical seminars you can go to. There are CPDs that are on offer, and you have a place to start. But if you don't have that within your country, the principles are still the same. You're seeking out the same learning. You might just need to reach a little further to find it.
Yeah, I think so. That's great advice. And I think that if you think about it, like for me, I think it's a great way to actually improve your own training is to be a coach or an instructor, because it forces you to understand things a little deeper. And like you need to have a great grasp of something to be able to teach it. And like for me, it's the best way to learn something. So if I want to learn a specific topic and share that with other people, I think that that's a great way for you to learn about it. And
Definitely.
so if you take that in terms of your Taekwondo training, whether that's learning about patterns a little bit more in depth, so you can teach them to the younger guys, etc., it all counts. I think that like getting involved, like you said, early is the best way to go. Like in terms of helping out your instructor, I'm sure they'll be glad for your help, particularly in this particular moment in time where space is limited, people, the resources that we have, etc., are limited. So I think any help that you can offer right now will be very, very valuable to the club. So yeah, I think my advice would be to get started, look up some things, try to learn from as many people as you can. Look to some people that you admire as coaches, try to take bits and pieces from them, come up with your own little system. Naturally, you'll probably end up doing the things that your own coach will do at the beginning. And then as you progress, you'll take bits and pieces from other people, come up with your own little recipe. You'll start reading, you'll start listening to videos, you start watching some how other people do it and things like that. So I think, yeah, the advice is sound. Get in there early, get that experience under your belt, and enjoy the process. It's a very, very enjoyable thing to do. And most people find out that they love it early on, and that's it.
That's it. So the next 3 questions that we have are all kind of geared in the same vein. So the first one is, what can or what would be the order to achieve a complete training? So we'll leave that floating out there, the order to achieve a complete training. I have a 14 kilo kettlebell at home. Any exercises to improve my taekwondo, and I'm sure a lot of people have found themselves in that position of, well, we're locked down at the moment. This is what I have access to. I still want to get better at taekwondo. What can I do? And then, is it worth lifting weights, the risk of becoming bulky, or body weight exercise instead? So I think all three questions kind of relate to how you structure or organize your training, and then in particular kind of facing those limitations that maybe the current circumstances bring. So the order to achieve a complete training, how did you interpret that one, Richie?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Like, what is a complete training? And I think that it's also something very, very difficult for us in particular, because what are we looking at? What's your goal? I think is the most important question here. What are you trying to achieve with your training? Is it getting? Is it competition? Is it self-defense? Flexibility? Who knows? I think that will guide this question a little better for anybody.
Yeah.
And particularly for us in ITF Taekwondo, we've got so many disciplines, so many aspects. Like, it's very difficult to complete all aspects in a particular training. So I think that first off the bat, that's the most important thing, to assess what you want to achieve and where you want to go. And I think that then you can answer the question of how to have a more complete training.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, if once you have the goal and you know what training would be structured to achieve that goal, then you can really answer that one well. And if this is your question, by all means, write back to us, give us a bit more detail, and we'd be delighted to offer a little bit more on it. This next part, though, when we were talking about the kettlebell and training at home, a kettlebell is a useful tool as much as any. Whether it's a dumbbell, a kettlebell, a skipping rope, a barbell, whatever it happens to be, they're physical training accessories. They are something that you can use to apply load, and there's in terms of improving your general fitness, your strength, your conditioning, any resistance that you're using or any load that you're using to increase resistance, it can certainly be used to increase the effect of that exercise. Does it do anything specifically for your taekwondo? Not really. It would be my answer to it. Although we do have a video posted where I use kettlebells to add leverage to some stretching. So, from that point of view, yeah, definitely you could take a kettlebell and use it to add some leverage for some movements. And particularly with flexibility, we'll often use a medicine ball to check our body position when we're carrying the front leg in some kicking exercises. So, to check your posture, or to add a little bit more weight to the leg that's pushing off. It's just increasing your body weight very slightly. So there are little things like that you might do in a more taekwondo specific way. But I would look at your kettlebell, I think, as that's your tool to improve your own general conditioning and fitness, and not specifically improve any taekwondo techniques.
Yeah, I agree 100%. For me, it's similar to the rope and skipping rope, that it's a great tool, and anything that makes you more athletic and more generally rounded as in terms of fitness and an athlete, fantastic. It can only be positive. But in terms of improving your taekwondo skill set, I think it's a completely different ball game here. And I think people think that a lot of these things just magically cross over, but like, if you can do 500 push-ups and then you're going to a sparring ring, that has nothing got to do with you competing in sparring. And
Sure.
some people think that there's a correlation there. For me, I don't agree. But as I said, don't get me wrong, anything that improves your overall athletic ability is fantastic. But I think when it comes to specific skills within Taekwondo, the only way to train them is train them.
Yeah, and in addressing this next question, I mean, I think one of the things that we're thinking is be really clear in your own mind that when you're training Taekwondo, the goal is to improve your Taekwondo. When you're training your physical, your strength and conditioning, your goal is to increase some physical capacity or another in that specific sense. And there is a crossover in that. If you're stronger, you can use your Taekwondo to express that strength. You can, if you become more agile, if you become quicker, you can use your Taekwondo to express those abilities. But if you haven't developed them through your Taekwondo, there's no automatic link. It's, it is needed, but they do help you set a higher baseline. So in the same way as you work on your flexibility, as your range of motion increases, your ability to kick higher should increase as well. But it still needs to be made specific to the kicks. In the same way you get stronger, you may be able to jump higher, you may be able to kick harder. You know, these things can happen, but it's going to need the Taekwondo training to translate that newfound physical ability into, you know, a skill. And I think it's that balance of how much time do you spend on your Taekwondo and how much time do you just spend on the ancillary things. And it depends what's important to you. If you want to look good, spend less time in your Taekwondo and more time in the gym or in the kitchen. You know, and that's if you want to look good. And it's like, if you want to move well and score points, well, spend more time in the gym doing your Taekwondo and less time, you know, focusing on the other elements. That's just specificity.
Yeah, that's it, 100%. And like for me, you hit the nail on the head there. It comes down to using your time wisely. I think that, like as you said, that if you're looking to, like, if we look at this specific question here, is it worth lifting weights? Like, of course it's worth it in terms of it's going to improve your strength overall, but do you really need that to be the complete athlete you need to be? You have to go back to, it depends. Like, what's the level that you're competing at? Are you competing in a local tournament at yellow belt? Like, it doesn't really matter then, really, does it? Whether you at the very high extreme end of being an athlete, you'll get some gains there as well, that will definitely benefit it. But again, I think that there can be better use of time, and I think that the reason that one of these kind of ideas of strength and conditioning come up so often is because they're much more measurable than skill.
Yeah.
Like how do you measure skill improvement? It's extremely difficult. Whereas, okay, I increased my weights by X amount. I reduced my heartbeats per minute by X amount. Blah 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 blah. Because they're more measurable, people naturally are more attracted to them, and I think that that's something that is massively kind of like attractive for people. And then as a result, it's what people believe that everybody needs to do. But I think it really, really depends on your specific individual situation.
Yeah, for sure. So our next couple of questions change the direction a little bit, and we go into the more...
Oh, sorry, we didn't even answer the question, did we?
In terms of the bulkiness?
Yeah, sorry. We just completely went on a rant there. So I'll just address it quickly. For me, I think becoming like bulky and lifting weights doesn't really come down to the exercises you use. It's more of like that whole bulky look and not being very agile comes more down to a continuous amount of excess calories. For me, that's what it is. You know, like if you're trying to bulk heavy, then that's where you're actually going to become bulky. Anybody who looks after their nutrition has it close to their maintenance levels. I think that there's no fear of you becoming bulky, to be honest.
No.
Like it's actually more difficult than you think to become bulky, particularly with lean muscle. So I think that my advice would be to, if you enjoy strength training, whether that's body weight exercises or in the gym with a bit more free weight, go for which one you enjoy more. I don't think it's going to have a massive impact either way, and I don't think it's certainly going to make you become bulky if your nutrition is in check.
Yeah, certainly there's a whole lot of competition bodybuilders out there who'd love to be able to go to the gym twice a week and gain kilos of bulk, and it just doesn't happen. There's a reason, there's a market for anabolic steroids, etc. So just don't stress it. It's not going to be a thing. We were going into a little bit of pattern advice and looking at the continuous movement in Po Eun. And for anyone who's not specifically ITF at this stage, you know, this probably won't interest you, but the deal is that in Po Eun, the continuous motion follows a little bit of an exception. So normally our continuous motion will have if it's two movements, it'll be 2 full sine waves, 1 continuous breath. And in Po Eun, after the first movement, the remaining movements are all performed with a half sine wave, just the raise and drop. But it's still 1 continuous breath the whole way to the end. And it's something that people find challenging. I think particularly it's just the breath control. So you could liken it to playing a didgeridoo or something. You have to manage to almost inhale, exhale in 1 continuous way as you go. It is a challenge. But, you know, the advice is always don't try to do all of the movements continuously from the start. Start with 1 at a time so that you actually learn the movements and you can finish them accurately at the correct levels, because that's usually atrocious. And then when you can do that, start to link them from the beginning to the end. So start to build them in sequences. So do 2 in continuous motion, do 3, do 4. And as your ability to control your breathing improves, you should be able to get through to the end without the break. The second thing is then very short, sharp exhales, because you have only, you know, hopefully 2 lungfuls of air. But you're you've only got a certain amount that you can actually, exhale. So if you're taking big, strong, pushy exhales with each movement, you're going to be gassed in the middle of it. You're going to have that big gasping breath, that and on again. And, that's what you want to avoid in Po. And you're looking to control the breath and keep it very short, sharp, and it's practice. And I think definitely the biggest one for me is start with just 2 or 3 movements and then add a 4th, add a 5th, and practice it outside of the pattern until you can do it there. Because arriving very slightly out of breath to that position, even just the timing of when you inhale and then begin your continuous motion needs a little bit of work.
Yeah, and of course, like if you're going to be conscious about this particular area, it's actually going to make your breathing even more stressed.
Yeah,
So I think like it's a catch-22 here. Like the more you try to get it done and rush it, actual worse it's going to be. So I think that it's important to balance it between not going too quick. Like you'll almost see people doing it in fast motion because of what you said with the whole idea of the sine wave.
yeah,
That then everything is just rush, 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 and that just doesn't work at all. So you just need to be able to just be calm, but at the same time get through it. I think that if you can just balance that, as you said, start with the 2 movements, 3 movements, 4 movements, make sure the lines are correct because, as you mentioned, that's something that's usually way off. So like, but that all comes back to just not rushing it and overdoing it. You got to get that fine balance between completing each movement correctly and then moving on to the next with having enough breath to be able to complete that movement strong.
definitely. So the next one is one that thoughts and tournament patterns. Would you change any rules? So the answer is yes,
Yeah,
and we're done.
I think I'm gonna leave you start off on this one. I think you've got some cool ideas and things like that. So my
Yeah,
my my interpretation was let's try that idea of having one person in the first round and bring it into a top 8.
yeah,
Because the reason I like that is because it's the same pattern for everybody, and it's a fair way to kind of get that interpretation. Also, you have a little bit better ranking, in my opinion. So,
yeah.
like, it's often the two top seeds, I think, are separated. Is that correct?
Yeah, but at European Championships, it's only from the previous Euros, and at Worlds, it's only from the previous Worlds at the moment. So you can easily end up with your European versus your South American champion in the first round. That can absolutely
Yeah.
happen. Yeah.
So I think that will help that for sure. It'll just make it a lot more interesting, especially when people put so much time. Like most of the time at senior level, they're going to be coming for one event, at the top level because they're putting so much time and effort into it, and particularly pattern. Like it
Yeah.
would be quite disappointing if you go all the way abroad, put all that month's training in to go out in just one pattern. So it will go get to maybe get the top guys just separated out a little bit. Of course, you got the same problem then. The people who are a little bit lower down the tier are probably going to go home early. But look, it has to be somebody. So at least give the guys who are at that top level an opportunity to compete at the top level and not be knocked out in the first round. For me, I think that will be a massive part to just a good stepping stone to improve the pattern system at tournament.
Yeah, I mean, certainly have plenty of ideas on what you might do with it. But for me, the very first thing is that we have moved in the ITF towards a scoring system that's far more detailed than it used to be. We used to have a 5 criteria scoring system with 5 points for, well, we'll go into that in a second, but 5 points for technical content and 3 each for rhythm, balance, breath control, and power. But it was done in a comparative system. So if blue was against red, you would rate each of them on technical content on a scale from 0 to 5. So, red could be a 3 against 5s, or against blues 5, as an example. But it was not fine-tuned enough, we'll say. It was the issue, I think, and the judging wanted to be a little bit more critical and less, well, I feel that it should be it's this. And I think what we've done is move to a situation where the scoring at the moment is very much it's against a notional perfect standard. So if everything happened according to the textbook, you would get 10 out of 10. And the reality is that when you look at how the deductions, for me at least, okay, and this always has to be a personal opinion, I don't believe that any judge in the world can live watch 2 people perform and accurately score the pattern. And the reason for that is it's very, very simple for me. People are not very, very good at making fine judgments under time pressure. what they can do very quickly is make comparisons. That was bigger than that. That was faster than that. That was higher than that. That was, they can make a comparison quickly. But what they really struggle with is that slow fine-tune thing. And you look at the sports that score this way, like diving, gymnastics, figure skating, etc. The judges watch it and they watch replays and they take a couple of minutes after the performance to deliver their technical score and then their performance score. We're doing it live while watching 2 performances at a time. So the argument becomes, do we watch only 1 performance at a time? I think yes, that will definitely improve the accuracy of the scoring of the individual performance, but it's boring. For me, if you don't have 2 people going head to head, what's the point in the pyramid? Like, I want to see them side by side, and for me, I want to compare you against you and see what you can do. I think it was a great move bringing the pattern so that you're performing the same pattern side by side. Really improved it. But I think most recent changes have been to make it easier for the judges to make those deductions. But I still think the emphasis of it should be comparing one competitor with the other. Now, if we ditch the comparing one competitor with the other and we compare a competitor against the technical standard, okay, I become less interested in pattern because, from a visual, perspective, it's a bit different. Training it doesn't change a thing. Like you still train it very much the same way. But for me, as a something to watch, as a spectator event, you take the personality out of it, where each person goes one at a time. There is, for me, no point in putting 2 people head to head against each other. That's just a way of sorting through it. You might as well just ask them to, we do a couple of cutoffs like X Factor. So everybody gets one audition. The top 16 go through to the next round. Everyone does a second audition on another pattern, and then you move them on. And then you pick a winner. It could be something as simple as that. But for me, the biggest challenge is when you're making deductions against an idealized perfect. It would be great if someone could show us perfect.
Yeah.
And we've never seen perfect. Not in practice.
Not only that, though, we also get major discrepancies in terms of scoring.
But I don't think that's even the judge's fault. I think they're being asked to do something that's not physically possible.
Yeah.
It's just like, no. So I mean, it's along the lines of you're driving down the motorway, okay, and you're going to count the cars passing you on the road. You're going to look at the cars passing you on the right, and as the cars pass you, we want you to deduct if, and we give you 23 criteria on each car, and it's basically at the rate of one movement passing you, one movement. There are 23, 25 possible things you could see that would be right or wrong with that movement. You make the appropriate number of deductions, and then overall you rate everyone's driving at the end. Like it's bloody hard, and you do that, except you're in the middle lane, there's cars passing you on both sides at different rates. And
of course you're naturally going to be, if there's a Ferrari passing that's nice, bright red, that's going to attract your attention much more. And it's the same way in patterns, where if somebody looks sharp and you're not really sure why, they're going to naturally get more of your attention. And it's just, it's human nature. And then, of course, the judging isn't going to be as accurate, is it?
Yeah, or if you have a very different rhythm and you finish 3 or 4 movements before your opponent, they're going to be just watched exclusively for the last while. There's a lot of little things like that. But again, the simple thing, the question was, what are my thoughts? For me, I would prefer comparative scoring head to head on who did it better, based on a number of criteria. And they don't have to be the old criteria. And the deductions could be more fine, or, it could be a different rating scale. But for me, I'd like to see it done comparatively. If we're not going to do that, I'd like to just acknowledge the fact that, well, we're going to be really asking the judges to do something difficult. Take away the second person. Don't go head to head at all. Don't use a traditional pyramid, and use just a ranking system. You give them 2 patterns, you give them 3 patterns, however many it is, to establish the ranking, the first, second, third, and that would be it. I'd love to see, if we went that way, something where when you step forward, maybe you have to choose a pattern, but maybe you can only do a pattern once. So for example, if you have 3 rounds in total, you pick a pattern for round 1, round 2, round 3, and maybe each one has a difficult or a different technical difficulty. So for example, if you get a difficulty of 10 for Juche, 9.5 for Moonmoo, or dropping it down to a 2 or a 3 for Chanti Dangon, and there's a factor where your performance score and the technical score are multiplied to get a final score. like very much like the other sports that are judged that way. Then it brings in an element of strategy to where, which pattern do I pick? How far do I push the technical difficulty to try to get the maximum performance score? You know,
That
and
could be
then
a way to spice it up a little bit, as you
yeah,
said, visually, and yeah, make it that's a great idea. I like that.
and potentially then if you lose your pattern, so if you want to guarantee you get to the second round and you use your best combination of the scores, well, you're going to have to do a more difficult pattern maybe in the next round, or maybe a slightly lower difficulty score pattern, and try to max your performance scores. Simply because it also allows maybe for people to take a pattern that isn't as demanding kicking wise, for example, or rhythmically, to try and get themselves through a round and into those final placings. I think it would be interesting, because if you're going to have to watch them one by one, I think I'd at least like to see different patterns performed, rather
Yeah.
than we're going one by one and every 4 to 6 degree does Moon Moo. Like, watching 30 guys do Moon Moo one after
Yeah.
another is not my idea of a great afternoon. Do you know?
Yeah, I like the way you're thinking there as well, to spice it up visually for people. I think that's important. And
Yeah,
of course, then if you bring in that idea, you're talking about people getting a bit more in tune with game theory and things like that, which is not a bad skill to have either,
there you go.
in terms of just keeping things exciting. So yeah, some good thoughts there.
Our very, very last question of the day, and very pertinent to the times that we're in. Can I continue to train when I'm sick? So do you want
No.
to...
Full stop.
No, full stop. I think we have to separate sick and injured. They're different things.
Yeah.
So if you're physically broken, but you can work around it to some degree, absolutely you should continue in your training. But I think when you're unwell, particularly if you're contagious, do everyone else a favor and stay away from the gym. But we've all been under the weather a little bit, whether you've sniffles, you've a cold, you've something like that, and you want to continue your training. And you have to kind of use your common sense with that. But I think the second you're, well, right now, uncontrollably coughing or sneezing or something like that, I think right now we have to be a bit more cautious, and that's when you do the brain training and you spend your time at home trying to get a little better.
Yeah.
Could you still work on your mobility or something like that while you're sick? Yeah, absolutely. As long as you're, you can certainly find something that you can train. But yeah, I think when you have that group training mentality, if you're contagious, do
Yeah.
the team a
Especially
favor,
not these
keep it
days.
to yourself.
Yeah, but look, when you're sick, there's a reason for you being sick. It's probably your body telling you that there's a need for a break or whatever.
Yeah,
Like I know, like it was strange. Like every time that I was going away to major championships, I would actually get sick beforehand, and it was because that I was training so hard, so hard, so hard, and then you take it back a notch,
yeah,
more than a notch usually, just to kind of reduce that volume, reduce everything, and like your body would actually react to that, and you would find yourself sick. So I think like there's always a sign there from your body that if you're unwell, there's a reason for it. So take that message on board, and maybe be no harm just to take a rest.
that's it. So if you enjoyed today's chat, make sure you give us a like on this video, subscribe, put something in the comments. Any engagement at all really helps us to get the message out to everybody else, help people find this channel and join the conversation. If the questions today prompted more questions from you, then by all means, put them in the comments on this video. Hit us up on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and all the rest, and we'd be delighted to engage with some of the questions. We do these Q&As whenever we have a good number of questions built up, and it's a nice way to tackle them all in a longer format
Yeah.
than the quick answer that we'd have on Instagram. But it's something that we really enjoy doing. And of course, maybe looking forward again to this week's Fight Chat Friday, where we're looking at continuing around the house and comparing the style in WT Taekwondo to ITF Taekwondo, and maybe looking at one or two competitors who've competed in both codes and what we have to learn one from each other. All right.
Good.